Hello, my name is Martina Flor. I'm a lettering artist, author, and educator. Do you know what my most powerful tool to create my work is? Not my hands, not my brain, but my eyes. I've been training my observation skills since day one, and that had a major impact on my skills and success as a commercial lettering artist. Not only that, it has helped me find inspiration everywhere around me and staying away from endless scrolling down Google, Pinterest, and Instagram. Have you ever been in the situation of looking at your drawing, knowing that something is off or that it's not quite ready yet, but not knowing how to fix it? Fear not. This training called Letter Hunters will help you develop what I call your typographic eye by just using inspiration from your surroundings. If you want to improve your work, you need to start by sharpening your observation skills. Join me and become the best letter hunter in town. See you inside.
Today, I'll be having a conversation with Gemma O'Brien, an internationally renowned designer and artist known for her bold graphics, illustrative lettering, and murals. Her work has been commissioned by Apple, Nike, Tiffany&Co, Google, and the New York Times. Outside her commercial design work, she explores language, nature, and the human experience through her art practice. Gemma has been in business for over 10 years. She has worked for huge clients and has traveled the world to be on stage at dozens of design conferences. What I love about this conversation with Gemma is how she allowed us to see the normal person behind a great artist. She spoke openly about her first steps into the business, the thinking behind some of the moves that she had to make throughout her career, and even share why she decided to stay in Sydney, where she lives now, while having the opportunity to move to cities, quote unquote, where opportunities are. I believe that a creative business is a place to explore and discover one's talents and creative voice, and Gemma really takes that to the next level. Enjoy this inspiring conversation with Gemma O'Brien. Great. So, hello, Gemma. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
So, Gemma, I like to start by the beginning of this conversation, and I would like to go chronologically. So later we can dig into different topics and different things that have to do with your creative path. But I want to know, where did you grow up and what's your family like?
Of course. So I grew up in Brisbane, which is in Queensland, Australia. And I grew up in a few different places. I moved house a lot. Lived in a place called Mount Glorious. I have one sister, and yeah, I had a very creative, quite free childhood. Yeah, it was good.
In which way you feel that it was creative? Were your parents, in the art world, or yeah?
Well, they weren't in the art world, like, in printing or design or anything like that. But my mum is an early childhood teacher, so she's a kindergarten teacher. And my dad is a builder, but he also designs a lot as well. So I guess it was creative in the sense that my mother, working with young kids, and like she kind of, I think, opened up opportunities to be free and creative and use my hands and that sort of thing. And then my dad, I always remember he could draw quite well. He didn't go out of his way to draw, but if we saw something, or if he was sketching for some designs, so he'd often have like papers around that we'd make. And I think it was more creative in the sense that it was like open. There wasn't like anyone saying, don't create art, don't draw. It was kind of encouraged. So yeah, not from an traditionally artistic family, but, openly creative.
And how did that go afterwards? So you grew up in this family where creativity was like a common thing, or it was allowed, and they were open, to allow you to explore creativity. How did you actually get into the path of design and, what you do today, which is, art and illustration and typography?
Yeah, it's interesting actually because when I think about it, like when I think of myself being like 6 years old, I
Mm.
imagine myself drawing being creative. But then in between, I don't know what happened, but some ideas started to come throughout primary school and high school, somewhere, I don't really know where, that maybe an artistic career wasn't something I should pursue. So
Mm.
I was always very academic. I was very good girl, did all my homework straight away, high achiever, in lots of different areas, like not just art, but maths and writing, everything. So some influence came into my mind that I should choose a smart career, and so when I did finish high school, I ended up going to law school.
Mm.
Um, for about a year and a half before I actually dropped out and made the switch to a Bachelor of Design. So something happened along the way.
And how was that moment of telling your parents, like, hey, I'm gonna, thinking of, I got a picture how growing up in that family was, and how was for your parents hearing from you, like, hey, I'm gonna pursue a career in law. What were they saying about that? Were they surprised? Were they like, okay, yeah, sure, Gemma is definitely born for this? And
Yeah, I don't remember the specific conversation. I think one of the other things when I think about both of my parents, they divorced when I was younger, so it was two separate
mm,
people. Like as I went into this path of my adulthood and choosing my career, but I actually don't remember what they said. I don't think it would have been necessarily a surprise because, at least from memory, whenever I make a decision, I am like very, confident and like, this is what I'm doing. So I think I might have been in that same way about choosing law school. And it was only, after getting into it and maybe getting to know myself outside of a school context and reflecting a little bit more that realizing maybe that wasn't something I wanted to do. But I think they're both very open in the sense that they was like, go along with whatever I say.
I see. And what were the things that you felt like you started this law? You started with law school.
Mm.
What were the things, like the cues that gave you the hint, like, hey, maybe this is not for me. Maybe this is not what I'm supposed to be
Yeah.
doing.
Look, I don't know. I'm trying to remember myself at that time as an 18-year-old. I feel like it's so young. You think you know everything, but you know nothing.
Yeah.
And I think deep down, I was like, this is the right thing to do. And I was studying really hard, and I'd come home and I would read, these legal precedents for like 4 hours every night. So, this basic stuff that's part of the thing. And I was getting good grades. It was something like deep down, I was like, is this truly where I want to be for the rest of my life? And I think it was just an unsettling sense that I knew that this wasn't my like true self or what I really wanted to be doing. And I do remember coming home one day from university and like Googling to see, like, maybe it wasn't Google back then, to just look up, what's an alternative, looking up other degrees and looking at design and, that cliche thing of like being a graphic designer where you design your favorite bands, right? Cover, you hear people say that, but that was like my only sense of what career options, I think, rather than doing fine art, which felt a
Mm,
little bit too like scary, maybe.
mm.
Design was a little bit safer, but still creative, I think.
So after a year or two, you said
Hmm.
on in law school, you decided to switch careers, and you signed up for a graphic design degree.
Yes, it was a Bachelor of Design, still in Queensland at this point. It was specialising in communications, and then I moved to Sydney and continued that at the College of Fine Arts here. So yeah, graphic design, did a bit of textiles and a mixture of things.
And what were the cues then in that experience that told you, like, hey, this is, I feel very comfortable here. This is something I want to do. And, I want to stay in this area.
Yeah, I remember just like the first year, like I think the first year of design school, and maybe it's similar in different schools around the world, but like it's quite broad. You learn like, I think there might have even been like a little bit of life drawing and all that observation. And I was so happy. It was like I was the happiest girl in the world. It felt like the most blissful period when I look back. And I actually live now close to the university I went to in Sydney, and I still like get these warm feelings about that period of like, you know, being a beginner, but like being a beginner in something that you're like really excited about, and it just felt right. So I think those were the cues that, you know, the excitement to like really being wanting to learn, and yeah, it was really a really good period.
And what came after that?
So in my second year, I got introduced to the letterpress studio, and this was real. Like, we'd learn about typography in the first year, but I didn't really click with it then. It was just, you know, InDesign and fonts, and I was not interested. And so one of my teachers like showed me how to use letterpress studio, and it was almost like, you know, so many people love lettering now, like with social media, it's like, it's very prevalent, but you probably know from that period, it was almost like discovering a secret nobody knew about. And, you know, learning letterpress, it was very physical, setting type by hand, and it was like this doorway open to like a history. And then you're seeing letters in your environment, and you're like, holy shit, like this is things it's been here all along, but there's these histories and these stories. And it was just like, yeah, it was very exciting. And so that really then set the path for like what I was interested in for the rest of my graphic design degree.
So you started experimenting with these letterpress machines, and were you creating a specific pieces of work, or just the idea of combining letter forms seemed interesting for you?
Yeah, so I like started to incorporate it into like our set university assignments. You know, I would make little word puns and poems and set them by hand. And then I also started a blog called For the Love of Type. It would have been, I think, in 2007, 2008. And, you know, on the blog, I would take photos of signs and share projects. And I started using the name Mrs. Eves because I discovered the story about this font. Designed by Emigre, and there's history around it. And I thought this is like a cool pseudonym that I could use to write my blog. And so for my second or third, I think it was third year graphics project, we had to create this kind of like campaign. And so I decided to write all over my body in Sharpie in like my newfound lettering skills. And, you know, I look back now and I cringe at this like art school project. But, you know, at the time it was like YouTube had just been invented. It was just the concept of like a viral video had begun. And so it was this video of me like writing these words all over my body, and like, you know, and so I put it on there for my tutors to mark, and it kind of got picked up by a few different typography blogs, and was definitely like this moment in the beginning of my career that, you know, changed things.
Can you tell us? Well, I know a little bit the specifics about
Yeah.
this, but I would love to hear the story. I know you may have
I'll tell you.
told this story millions of times, but it's super interesting because it's kind of like, I feel that, you know, nowadays there's kind of like a lot of people kind of searching for that kind of effect, the viral effect of something, like creating something that really triggers your career. And, you know, I know that this is like a very, in a story that doesn't happen so often, but in your case it did happen. So that specific video really triggered a series of events that really, you know, made a mark in your career. So can you tell a little bit about what happened with that video?
Absolutely. So I posted the video on YouTube and onto my blog, and, you know, at the time, the only people who were looking at the blog, as far as I knew, were like, you know, typography world people. Not many people. Didn't have a big audience, but there were a few people who would maybe email me and chat. And a few weeks after I posted the video, this article appeared on the font blog website, which at the time was the blog component of the font shop, you know, which sold fonts. like the marketing arm of it. And, you know, it was in German and I didn't speak German, and I wasn't really across the industry. I was still only 20 years old, like very young designer, like with little skills and just putting out these, you know, experiments and passion things. But I got an email from Adam Twardok. I think I remember his name. Do you know him? Yeah.
Yeah.
And he shared this article with me, and he said, look, I thought you might be interested in reading a translation because it's on Font Shop's blog. It's quite, you know, got a big readership in Europe. And the title of the article was Amateur Designerin hat Sex mit Buchstaben, which means amateur designer has sex with letters. And it kind of started about the video that I had made, but then also went on to talk about, like, you know, who is Mrs. Eves, because I was using this name on my own blog, and it was like, is she a student? Is she a designer? I think it was critical in a way. It's been a very long time. I don't even know if the article still exists anywhere, but it was quite critical of me and what I was putting out there. And what ended up happening was a lot of readers of the blog kind of came back, I guess, in support, or said, you know, like, you know, don't give this person such a hard time. Maybe it's a young designer experimenting, exploring. And so then after that, I received a message on Facebook from Jürgen Siebert. Do you know Jürgen?
Yes.
Yeah. And he said,
So
I think
just
he wrote the article.
to give a little bit of context, Jürgen Siebert was the head of marketing at that time of Font Shop, which is one of the biggest type foundries here in Germany and all over the world. It was bought by Monotype recently, but that's a different story. But he was also the organizer of a big international conference, which was Typo Berlin. So he was a very influential person in the world of type. Just to give a little bit of context of who Jürgen Siebert is.
And, you know, I didn't really know this either. And so when he then sent me a message on Facebook a few weeks after the blog post and the response from the blog post, and it was something like, you know, he said, I'm the one who wrote the article, you might have seen it, and I would like to invite you to speak at Typo Berlin. And so, you know, I'm like a third year design student in Australia, and, you know, there wasn't a big typography community here at the time. It wasn't a big design. You know, I'd been to like maybe one design conference in Australia, and I was like in shock, you know, like, and so I said yes. I don't know what I was thinking saying yes. I said yes, and then
amazing. Yeah, at that time it's kind of like a free trip to Berlin if you like.
I mean, yeah, and I think there must have been some kind of like naive confidence that came with it, with not knowing, never, you know, not knowing the world of the design, never having spoken at a conference. So I said yes. And then a year later, it was the following June. So they flew me out and I had to do like a 45-minute, you know, a standard conference talk. And, you know, I was aware that I was a student, that I'm not going to be coming with, you know, new fonts that I designed or my client list. So I just basically, you know, I did a talk as I was, you know, as a student, and talked about the things that inspired me and my story. And I made like a little mini documentary about the designers in Australia working with type, because I think that was at the time, you know, it wasn't as well known. So I wanted to hear from like experts, I guess, in the field, like to see if there was like an Australian voice, I guess, to the typography and design scene here. And, you know, so this was like this whirlwind experience when I was 21, and kind of came back to Australia after the conference and just went back to my regular design school classes. But, you know, obviously it had a huge impact then on the course of my career, having done that.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a little bit about that. I have like a lot of questions. First, I can imagine, you know, as a 20-year-old being featured on such a big blog at that time in the typographic world, and also having, you know, a critical or having someone criticizing you on what you had done. I was just thinking, like, what what were you feeling? What were your feelings around that? What does, did you feel any anxiety around what they were saying? Did you think that it was funny, or how was that? Because nowadays with social media and, the online world and being featured in that, on blog posts and stuff, this can be something really great for someone and can be flattering, but it can also be really diminishing and can make you feel really bad about what you're doing. So how was that for you?
Look, to be honest, I think at the time when it happened, because the YouTube video of this art thing that I did was also taking off. I think I was like swept up in the excitement, and I don't remember feeling like negative feelings about the writing, but I think it's because I almost felt like at that point I had nothing to lose. Like I didn't have a career, so I was just swept up in the craziness of the whole experience. But I do think that afterwards, it was a little strange in the sense that, I got invited to speak then the following year at Typo again, straight afterwards. And I said no, because I felt like, well, I actually, I want to begin making real work, begin my career as a real designer, I guess, not as like a gimmick art school project thing that just got attention. I think I wanted to pursue more. And so in the period when I came back, I think I withdrew a little bit from like the very much like the type focus community. And, I got a job when I finished design school working at Animal Logic, which was like visual effects and graphics, but not really like lettering and type focused. And I stopped writing on the blog, and I kind of like just went away and like followed a bit more of what felt like a natural path. And it probably wasn't until maybe 5 years, 6 years after that I started to, put myself out there again as a freelancer and share my work. And I almost wanted to distance myself in a big way from that being the same person.
Yeah, I can totally see what you mean. That once you create a product and that product works, the kind of like the industry wants the same product, to use the same product all over again, and you didn't want to become that product of that art school girl who painted typography on her body and just do that through your entire life. And I was wondering, like, you mentioned that you came back, or you just pulled out of this these things that you were doing with the blog and kind of try to explore what you wanted to do. So what did you do to do that? So you were still in art school, and you decided to employ yourself somewhere, or you decided to go freelance? How was that?
Yeah, so there was a couple of things. As part of the design degree, in the final year, we had to do industry placement or, job at work experience. So that was my first job, was part of the university requirement at Animal Logic, where I then kind of stayed on as a designer. And I continued to work in that same industry where it was more film and titles and graphics focused for another year after that, for another company called Fuel VFX. So I was doing things like a junior designer would, some of the jobs would be like small, and the things that the lowest person in the art department does, like setting up the lines at the end of the insurance commercial, and you set the type at the end. And then other times, I got given more creative freedom where I could come up with concepts for a little animation or a title sequence for a TV show. And those parts of it I really like enjoyed and thrived and took on my own voice a little bit more. And there was one that was quite a turning point at my job at Fuel VFX, where I got to kind of art direct and oversee an animation for Taronga Zoo, which is one of the big kind of conservation wildlife zoo organizations here in Sydney. And it was an opportunity for me to like basically do all the artwork. So I created these watercolor pieces and someone else animated it. And I got a lot of creative ownership, and I think that sparked something in me where I remembered, I guess, the joy of having more creative control, and seeing something through that wasn't just, I think there's lots of great things about working in a team, and I learned a lot of those in those years. But then at that moment, I was like, okay, maybe I'm ready to go out on my own again or do something. But I had this safety of a full-time job. And as a young person in my 20s and getting a full-time wage in a good design company, it felt like that's what you strive for. So I didn't have the guts immediately to just be like, I'm going to quit. But a few months after that project, the company went into liquidation. And so everybody lost their job. And that was it for me. I was like, am I going to go back and work somewhere else? Or is this the time that I begin my freelance career? And so I did that.
So you did that. Yeah. And how were the first, like, you were left out of your job, and you were actually a full-time employee, so you didn't have any structure prepared to market yourself and offer, go knock some doors and get some clients. So how did you do that? How did you went from being full-time employed, being left out of the job, and starting your own practice?
Yeah, it was a very interesting time, and it was different to now because it was the beginning of Instagram, like the early, about 2000. I think Instagram started in 2011, maybe 2010. So this was around like 2011, 2012. And, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a business model or like, specific clients or anything. But I did know about the Jackie Winter Group, which was like an illustration agent in Australia. So they represented a lot of illustrators whose work I had followed. So they had been on my radar. And around the same time that I left, they had reached out about one specific project. So they weren't reaching out to like take me on as an artist officially, but they had said, an advertising client wants to work with you. So do you want to do this project together? Almost like, I guess, and see how it goes. So of course I said yes. And it was for Woolworths, which is like a big supermarket chain here in Australia, one of the big two, for their Christmas campaign. And they wanted some custom lettering. And so this was like, it was almost like that feeling of being in art school, this like so excited, like being offered this like a professional job as a freelancer. And it was, a good budget, and it was like a whole new world was opening up again. So I did that project, and then from that point signed with Jackie Winter Group, and that helped, the flow coming through of some initial work. And at the same time, I was posting a lot on Instagram at this time. So, I wasn't working full time. So I had like this free time to explore experiments, and I just put it out there. It was just like I'd do some calligraphy tests in ink, and I'd just put out the process, put out my inspiration, treated it like a blog, and that I think started to also open up new clients as well.
So I want to make a left turn here, and because I feel that something particular about you as an artist is that you don't only do not only do commercial work for clients and for brands, but you also do this, you also have this artistic exploration of yours, and you create your own exhibitions at galleries. You're about to also have an upcoming exhibition on China Heights, which is the gallery you work with, and you usually do your shows with, which is the China Heights China Heights Gallery, and it's coming up on February 11th through March 11th. So I'm going to add this to the show notes. But what I wanted to ask you is, how do you get into this world? Because on one side, you have this commercial work you do for clients and brands. And on the other side, you have this amazing space to explore your work and to find new ways of expression. I see you on Instagram sometimes, and I feel that you allow yourself some time to just spend time at your studio creating this concept for an exhibition. And I wonder, how do you get there as an artist? How do you get there while making work for clients where you have to, work with deadlines and work with feedback rounds? And how do you manage to get that space to create work for your own shows? And also, how do you engage a gallery to work with you? So there's a bunch of questions here. But I know that I read somewhere that one of the biggest milestones in your career was creating this or painting a large-scale installation in 2012. And I wonder how that influenced what you do today, which is, this big part of your work that is creating shows or personal shows and exhibiting at galleries.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, the balancing commercial work with working with brands and clients and the gallery stuff is it's something I'm constantly thinking about and recalibrating. And sometimes, there's long periods where I'm so busy with commercial work that I neglect the more open art practice. And then, this last year, I've had this very shift in balance where I've been in one place in Sydney and had a lot of studio time to focus on an exhibition. So it kind of ebbs and flows, but I think I do like having both of these worlds. Sometimes I'm like, I just want to do this, and sometimes I want to do this, but I do actually think there's strengths to having both. I think the first time I started working with China Heights this is 7 years it's been that I've been working with them as a gallery. So I remember them, as an art student, I remember going to shows at their gallery, and they're quite different to a lot of the other, I guess, art galleries in Sydney. It's definitely more of a it's like they have a unique approach of working with artists, and they often work with people on the edges of design and art, and then more traditional contemporary artists as well. I think I might have I don't actually remember how it happened, but I know for my first show, I reached out to Ed, the gallery director, and maybe I even just said, I'd love to do an exhibition. I'd put put it out there, and it happened, so and from that point forward, it's always been something that when I'm taking a time from my commercial work, I'll either be thinking about what can I do in the show, or once the deadline is there, be working towards this work. And the first few shows had these big installations, these murals. And I think what happens is it's always those free, more open experiments that you do that start to shape the client work that starts to come in. So, putting out these installations, often some of these early art pieces I did will be stuff that then clients bring back into the briefing for a project. And, it's not the same thing. Often with brand work, it has to be more legible, or it has to be different in some ways, but it's almost like a reference point in some way. And sometimes it takes a couple of years though. I did this exhibition with them where I had the word heaven, because the gallery's up all of these stairs, so it's quite high up, and I liked the idea that you're walking up to this big text that said heaven. And that style that I explored in that mural, then a couple of years later, got clients asked about kind of recreating something similar for big commissions. And so it's always interesting to see, the way that it flows into different work.
Yeah, that I wanted to ask you a little bit about this. Kind of go into I would say the reality of creating these shows, right? Because I think that you are, correct me if I'm wrong, but you do this regularly every season or every other season. So you create an exhibition with this gallery. So you have been working with them and creating this exhibition and exhibiting in this gallery, right? And I wonder, I can imagine that there's a lot of thought and time that goes into creating the concept for the exhibition, but also, you know, actually creating the work. And I wonder really how that works monetarily, and if that works monetarily in terms of, like, you were just saying that one of the pieces you did once for an exhibition later got commissioned by, I remember it was a jewelry brand. Can it be?
Tiffany&Co?
Yeah,
Tiffany&Co.
exactly. So that, you know, that kind of led or attracted the attention of a big brand who commissioned you for, and actually paid money for that, right? So I wonder how, you know, for those listening as well, like, I wonder how the art world works in terms of, you know, the art and gallery world works in terms of making money for those artists. If it's more of a platform where you show your work and you get connected with a lot of different people, or if it actually also brings some monetary reward.
Yeah, so I guess like with those early exhibitions, in addition to the mural, I would also have like works on paper that would be sold, or like with my upcoming exhibition, there's no mural and there's canvases and works on paper that are all for sale. So obviously, you know, it's a completely different model to like working with brands and you know, the way that you do pricing around like the usage and the licensing and that sort of thing. But I guess the way that I see it and see myself is like the umbrella world of like being an artist or a designer, like it's so fluid. And I think it would be different if I was only doing contemporary art and relying on that as my sole livelihood. But I think it's a matter of like kind of balancing, you know, obviously I want to do these creative things. But if it's just an installation and it's only there for an experience and there's nothing to sell, then that changes the dynamic of working with a gallery. So I think it's about balancing, you know, it's almost like I sometimes feel like, okay, I want to do these crazy things, but I also, you know, I do like the idea of like selling work and creating things that people can keep. And I do also like working with brands where it's almost like a merging of maybe some part of myself with maybe a brand's idea. So yeah, it's, did I answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I have also a follow-up question to this, which is, you know, because as I said, the gallery world and the art selling world is not so widely spread among commercial artists. There's a few commercial artists that actually get their work exhibited at galleries, or they work towards creating shows that are exhibited at galleries. And I think it is interesting to understand how that work works, because it works very different from, you know, a client coming to you commissioning artwork for a specific campaign, right? And I wonder if the gallery actually has a say on the concept of the show and the pieces that you are creating. If they come to you and say like, hey, if they come to you kind of with their knowledge and their experience at knowing what sells and knowing what the people is looking for, and they tell you like, hey, Gemma, I think that, you know, this piece is too out there. Perhaps you can create something that is less colorful or more in the, you know, gray tones or whatever. I'm just, you know, it's...
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, I don't know, I can't speak for obviously other galleries and how they work with their artists, but it's not like that at all. I think it's very different from, there's no rounds of review or client feedback. It's definitely more like, you know, trust the artist to go for it. You know, with this most recent exhibition, I did, because I was here and in the studio and like not traveling as much, I did have the gallery come and have a look in my studio as I was working, just to like, you know, get some feedback, just because I wanted to share the process. But it's not as though there's any kind of rules around what I could do. There might be some discussions around, like, you know, I was originally doing like big pieces on paper, and we would think about things like, okay, well, if somebody wants to buy that overseas and it's framed and it's glass, we might think about like logistical things, but like overall creatively, it's definitely, you know, in my hands, which, you know, I think can be a great thing, but it's also, yeah, like it is a big responsibility and a lot of creative effort. Like, you think you want freedom and then you have it. And you realize that sometimes that could be harder, and it's easier if someone's giving you feedback quickly.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to see or to hear that as much as creative freedom you have to create this this exhibition, there's also a thinking behind, which is like, okay, how can we compensate the gallery and the artist for all the work invested? And if you're creating a mural or an installation in the gallery, how can you create other additional pieces that you can sell to people that is coming to the exhibition, right? So there is a thinking, it's not art for the art, for doing art just like that, but it's also, there is a thinking behind of how can we compensate for the time we invested into creating this, right? Which I think is super important, and we often forget about speaking about this, like, hey, how can we compensate the artist? It's not just doing art for art's sake, but
Yeah, and I think it's definitely something that I think about also in terms of like the experience of art. Like, when I think about when I went to some of my first galleries, like when I was younger, or even when I first came to Sydney and I went to like a Yayoi Kusama exhibition, and like, you go to these galleries where they have acquired like these really big name artists, and maybe it's $20 or it's free, and you come and it's about a public experience in a way, and I love that part of art, or traveling to different countries and you hear about these people, and it's, obviously it's different than to go into like contemporary artists who are making work now to smaller spaces, when it does become about, more about like selling artwork versus experiencing artwork. And I think I sometimes struggle with this idea, because I love the idea that if I could just always paint an installation and it's there for a month, and people come and experience it, everyone can come and be inspired to make their own things. But obviously, it's a different, it's about balancing all those aspects. So I do actually have now in my studio space, part of the reason when I moved into it, it's got these big walls, and part of the reason that I chose that space was because I like the idea of almost creating something in between like an official art show and more like an open studio, where I can play around with big ideas and people can look through the windows or see them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, like this is part of an exhibition or it's for sale or anything like that. So I guess moving into the future, like it's almost going to be a mix maybe of like, what are these spaces that don't have to be art galleries where I can explore other ideas? And and these days I feel like it's like a lot of traditional structures in the world in general are starting to be questioned or to be assessed of like, what are the good things about the way that these things work, obviously with NFTs and digital artwork, and this whole revolution that's happening in that regard is changing things as well. So I think it's good to like reflect on, what are the spaces where we make art and share art. I don't think that I think you can do both. I think you can do commercial work and work with brands. And I think it's really important to make things either for yourself. It doesn't even have to be with a gallery. Like if there's young designers who are, doing brand work, like it's in the process of making things that is more directed by what your interests are or what's inspiring you, where like really interesting work can come from. And I think that's like the most important part of it.
Gemma, I want to ask you a little bit about other life decisions that you have made, because many of the artists and designers that I invite to the podcast have relocated cities, and myself, I have relocated cities.
Wait, where are you?
Yeah, well, I'm in Berlin, but I
Okay.
was born in
Of course.
Argentina.
Okay.
I moved to
Yes.
Barcelona, then to The Hague, and then I moved a couple of times, but I've been
Yeah.
living in Berlin for over 10 years. And many of the people that I invite to the podcast have relocated cities in one way or another. And I'm always curious to know why they did it. Why would you choose going somewhere else to do the work you want to do, right? And I want to do the same question to you. And I imagine that it has crossed your mind to relocate cities. And I can imagine that your agent or your friends have suggested like, hey, why don't you go for a couple of years to your city or stuff like that. And I wonder, why did you decide to stay in Sydney? And how do you think that also impacted your career?
This is a good question, and no one's ever actually asked me it before, so I'm pleased that you have asked it. Look, Australia especially, there is a strong, like culturally, there's like cultural cringe. It's like a thing here where it's like if you're going to make it in whatever field, you have to leave and go to New York or LA or Europe. So when my career started to gain momentum it was 2012, 2013, I definitely started to travel a lot, like to the US and to America. And that had a huge impact on, getting clients. I obviously then got an American agent. A lot of people still actually think that I live in America because I would be there so often and my agents are in America. So it was, I think, also like the illusion, like no one really knew where I was. But the reality of that then in the following 5 years, once I started doing mural commissions, was like a lot of travel, like every month, like around. And part of that was exciting and thrilling, but I don't think I ever, until the last 2 years, actually then got to experience what it is like to be like working as a professional artist and designer and staying in one spot. Because when I did used to travel, I loved the idea of coming home to Sydney, like the lifestyle here. I love being at the beach. I moved from Brisbane to Sydney, which was a very small move. But at the time, it made me feel like Sydney was my home that I chose. And it was like my creative home that I chose. It was like all these ideas I was talking before about art school. Like it felt like this was where it happened for me. And I also really, like, I know that being inspired is important and being like in a creative community is important. And when I would travel to these big cities, I would definitely get this boost. But I also had this very strong sense that the best work that I ever made was always just like, it came from being alone in my studio time. And I felt like it doesn't actually matter where you are. Like that is the most important, that's the place where you create the work. So if you have that, it doesn't matter where you are. I think that was also helped by the fact that social media was taking off, so you could be visible in other places. But so that's, I have always had a soft spot for Sydney, and, it's coming up again now. Me and my boyfriend are talking about like, I think everyone's in this period like of the pandemic where we've had this long period of staying still and people are kind of getting excited again to live back in similar ways or be out there. And I think I'm definitely not going to return to this high travel schedule. It didn't seem good for me or the planet or anything, but I do think there's this feeling of like, okay, maybe there's somewhere else on the horizon. But it's only very early stages of having that conversation. And I think Sydney will always have a special place in my life. So, yeah.
So that was a decision you didn't make, or you actually made a decision of staying in one place. And come with me while I try to, kind of do a segue into the next question, which is, so that was a decision you made in your career. I don't need to relocate cities to take off and to find a platform for me to thrive in what I do, right? And, you know, you started with lettering or doing illustrative typography. You know, there are so many ways of defining your work. That's why I speak about typography and lettering and art and illustration, but you touch on all of these things, right? And, you know, when you started over 10 years ago, the scene was very different, and has been a boom in lettering. And I feel that there's the overall perception, or I hear from students I work with or from people I interview or I'm in contact through my work, that there's the overall perception that there's a boom of kind of everything, of lettering artists out there, of illustrators out there, of designers out there, right? So it seems that there's a boom on all the creative disciplines, and you are much more exposed to what other people is doing in Japan and is doing in the US and all over the world, right? And I'm wondering, like, having into account all the decisions you made throughout your career, like one of them being, for instance, deciding to stay in Sydney and not relocating cities just to get more clients or whatever. What were other decisions that you made that if you were to start your career again, you will do again, or you would not do again? I hope that's clear.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
you know, building on your past experience, imagine that you are leaving art school all over again and knowing all that worked for you in the past. What will you do again? And what wouldn't you?
I think I've actually been thinking about this question for myself with like this new next part of my career. I think like what advice like still applies now that would have applied like when I was 20 in university. I think the things that I would do the same would probably be like focus on real life relationships, because when I look back on a lot of the client work that has come along or some of the big projects, it's almost like it seems like magic or like serendipity or like, oh, like this happened. But then when I actually look a bit closer, I often see like, oh, like, you know, that was someone who I worked at in that design firm, and then they knew. There is still like a lot of value like in genuine human connection. So I think that continues and potentially is even more powerful with like so many people on social media and so much out there, that maybe it's actually like real, true human connections that have more of an impact than just digital work being put out there. And then the other thing I think is to like continue to follow those like weird quirks or things that you're really interested in that excite you as a way of like making your own work. This is also something that I'm again like trying to reconnect with myself, because you know it's easy I think when you're a student to do this because you have a lot of freedom, you don't have clients to lose, you're just like, it is a experimental time. So you're like, you know, you're inspired by like, for me, it might be like weird song lyrics or like just little things that you might make artwork out of that isn't for anyone, but it kind of keeps the fire alive. And to continue to like pursue those, you know, obviously in balance with, you know, making a career or building networks so that you can support yourself to do that. But yeah, it would be like human connection and, you know, tapping into these deep passions that are truly you.
Yeah, and that's super interesting because, you know, we started speaking about your first step towards, you know, finding out what you like doing, but also being or getting some sort of exposure And that for you was, in a way, social media or going viral with your blog and your videos. And I find it really interesting that you still make a point on like, yeah, that has made or that had an impact on my career, but it's still the things that I feel that had a real impact on getting jobs or really doing the work I love have to do with the real life relationships. And I think that's really that's a really grounding concept, because nowadays we are so worried about like being there on social media or, posting every day. And it's like, yeah, but don't forget about that other thing that is the real life relationships. And I wanted to also make a note on, I've been following for ever, Gemma. I think the first time we met was in Berlin. You were also, it was at the Tipo Berlin conference. And we shortly met at that time. You were, as you said, that was the moment where you had some sort of momentum with your career, or you were starting to take off with what you were doing. And I remember, you have a big social media following, and social media was a big platform for you as an artist, right? And in a way, you had a lot of exposure through social media as well, because you had such a big following on social media. You had also, you were kind of like using social media to show the world the work you were exploring at the moment. And I wonder right now, I've seen like a big shift on the way you use social media, or how less you have started using social media. And I wanted to ask you why this happened, and what are the processes behind staying a little bit away from social media? Even now that we are all at home, that you're traveling less, that you may have more time in your hands where you could be using that into nurturing your social media accounts, but you have decided against that. If I'm not wrong, this is an outsider's perspective, and I might be reading this completely wrong, but I want to hear from you, like what were your decisions behind showing up less on social media?
No, you're not wrong. This is like definitely, I've definitely pulled back over the last, I'd say it was like probably 2 years. It wasn't like a conscious thing. It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to stop using social media. It was more, I started to notice a few things about the way I was working. And one of them was this idea of like being in the studio, making something, and almost like thinking in captions, like thinking about what I was making in the way that I was going to tell the world about it. And then also interrupting the process to document it, to share. And for a while, I kind of like dipped in and out, where I would like still do it and miss it, or notice that maybe, if I don't post, I don't get as much work. I would like kind of toyed with this idea. And then there was 2 big blocks this year and last year where I'm like, you know what, I actually just want to make this work in the process for myself. And I felt as though for like almost 10 years, I had been focusing on like the sharing and not the experience. And it started to become less fun. And like right now I am experiencing very complicated feelings about social media, because, I had this big period, especially when I was working on my exhibition, where I deleted Instagram, or I didn't have the apps, and I was in the flow. Like I experienced joy while I was creating. I had true moments of like following an idea, seeing where it went next, purely from being guided with what felt like the right thing to do, as opposed to, here's a little snippet, like, what do you think? And then using that to shape what comes next. And so now it's coming up to promoting my show, and it's almost like I have too much content to process, to share. And I'm excited. You know, the thing is, I'm trying to find a balance now where it's like, I know that when I see something that is really well done or that someone's made with care and excitement, I feel excited to go and make something myself. And that is the best part about seeing other creatives work, is like, you're all part of, like, we're all connected and we're all making things together in this world. And if you feel good making things and it inspires other people to do that, then that's the best part. But I don't think that's the only thing that social media does. And so I'm like just trying to work out, like, how do I find a balance between inspiration, sharing, being excited about the things that I've discovered or the processes, but fitting that into this new world where it's like there's so many platforms and ways to do that. And part of me is like, adapt or die, make reels, share it that way. And the other part of me is like, no, I'm going to quit now and like not do any. So I don't think either of those is going to be the way, but it's definitely something that I'm constantly like navigating. And I think also because I haven't had this travel, I haven't had, workshops and speaking events and murals, there's a lot less of the human interaction side of it that used to like inspire me. So I think it'll be an interesting few years ahead of like finding a balance between all of these things.
Yeah, I think I totally resonate with this idea of like these distractions, social media or even traveling for work, like getting on the way of the actual work. And yes, I can totally relate as well with this mindset of like, which I had it as well, especially with Twitter. I actually quit Twitter like a year ago and it's been life-changing. But this idea of like experiencing life through captions, like going through and, thinking on something and then thinking like, okay, how can I tweet about this thing that I'm thinking about now? And, make it funny and clever. And it's like so much time that goes into just creating a tweet and just freeing yourself from that. I think it can be really liberating and it can allow a space for a lot of other things that are perhaps more meaningful. And I can still see a clear concern there, which is like, hey, I still want to inspire people and I still want to speak about this work that I have created for this show. And, how can I do that without getting on the way of my own work, right? And I think is perhaps finding, I'm thinking out loud here, but for me it has been perhaps finding more efficient way of sharing my work or my own creative path that doesn't have to do with being constantly oversharing what I do at every minute of my life, right? Yeah. So, allowing some sort of blocks where I kind of think of what I want to say or what are the messages that I want to put out there in the world and kind of working on them, focusing on what I want to say and kind of, allowing chunks of time to do that and then just living my life normal without having to share things constantly on social media. I think that has made a big difference in my own.
I do think that sounds like the approach of like, it's almost like now because it is, when it started, it was different, but now it's almost like another part of your business that you have to kind of like, if you want to communicate effectively, it takes time sometimes to like, do that. And it is, and when choosing when it's important and what's important, and making the time to do it. So, yeah.
Totally. So I want to dig, as a last question, I want to dig a little bit deeper into what's your exhibition about, the exhibition you're working next, which is coming up on China Heights in Sydney, right? Is it already done? Is it ready? Are you working on that right now?
So it's finished. It opens tomorrow night. So 24 hours from now, the opening will be finishing up. yeah, I finished all the work. It's hanging in the gallery. It's been about a year of working on it at different stages. And kind of tying together everything that we've talked about, like the being in one place, not traveling, being in the studio, having more time for an art practice. I really wanted to use this as a way to one, create stuff all by hand. And the reason I say that is because I've done previous exhibitions where I did screen printed elements, and obviously with digital client work, it's computer based. So I wanted to go back to this real analog, working with pencil, charcoal, oil pastel, and paint. So the name of the exhibition is Seasons, and it's more an umbrella term, something that people are familiar with, but that really represented my experiences during this time with, starting to notice the weather changing in one spot, or even just being aware of when we were in lockdown in Sydney, I would go for these walks up Oxford Street at night and notice there was a really bright star, and then realize, using the app with the planets, that it was Venus, and these very small little joys of curiosity that started to happen. And I'm always keeping little phrases to maybe turn into art. So things like witnessing something that someone might turn into a landscape, but using the words to describe it. So one of them says day moon over Shark Island. And it's quite a weird thing. It maybe doesn't make sense to you. But it was literally, I was sitting on a ferry one day with this extra time, and I look out and I saw this beautiful crescent moon above an island in Sydney called Shark Island. And I just found this beautiful moment of stillness on the ferry. And I just like it because, especially in the lettering world, we're always using quite generic phrases of things or picking things that people know, or an inspirational quote. And so I'm I wanted it to be really weird and specific to something. And I also wanted to start just playing with color and moving away from really detailed illustration and just exploring color shifts. So it was basically a collection of all these little experiences, looking at clouds, listening to podcasts about astrophysics and space. And over the year of drawing and creating based on these experiences, it started to naturally come together around this idea of seasons, or a passing of time, or just even having a reference point, something that spring, and what you come to expect from this thing that we know. And then maybe it doesn't turn out how we expect. So it was almost like a metaphor, I guess, for this period of change and uncertainty, but also with an undercurrent of optimism and excitement for maybe what's next. So I really went out there with color, and the big 4 canvases that will feature on the main wall are loosely linked to, spring, summer, autumn, winter, but, they're not literal as you might expect. And it was it was a beautiful period of being in the studio and just exploring. So I'm very excited to open it up to, well, not the world, just Sydney, because no one can come here at the moment, but, I'll be sharing some more over the coming months. So yeah, super excited.
So I'm going to add the link to the show on our show notes so that everyone can go check it out. But also, I appreciate that you sort of walk us through the process of creating an exhibition and what comes together when creating the concept for an exhibition, which is, to me, really new in the sense of being someone who works primarily for clients, for someone, who creates through the request of a client assignment or a certain project. The way you navigate creating a project or a show for a gallery is so different, right? And I can totally understand why you continue doing that, because it's so fulfilling to just put all these thoughts together and these experiences together into something that is really personal. And especially when it comes to typography, as you said, we illustrate messages from other people or things that other people want to communicate. And there's a big power into illustrating your own thoughts and your own or the own words you want to illustrate. So I can totally understand now why you continue investing some time into creating your shows and, you know, allowing space in your agenda to create these shows, because it must be so fun to put all this together.
Yeah, you should do one, Martina.
Gemma, thank you so much for today's conversation. There's so many things that you have shared, and I'm sure that listeners will find it super insightful. Where can people find you?
So you can visit my website, GemmaO'Brien.com. If you want to work with me, it's LLWraps. And of course, Instagram, Mrs. Eves 101.
Mrs. Eves 101. Yeah, I remember that. I definitely follow you. And I'm going to add this to my show notes as well. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Gemma, again. And see you on the next episode of Open Studio. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye.
So this is it. I hope you loved this episode. You can find me, the host of the show, on social networks at Martina Flor on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you have a question or comments, go to martinaflor.com/podcast, where you can see previous episodes, find show notes, and send voice memos with your comments and questions. You can also watch these episodes on YouTube. Just go to martinaflor.com/YouTube to find them. You can, of course, listen to all our episodes on your favorite podcast platform. If you loved this episode, subscribe to this podcast. And if you leave us a review, it will help others find us. Thank you all for listening, and see you in the next episode of Martina Flor's Open Studio. Bye-bye.